So welcome back to week one, part two. This lecture continuing our analysis of the early history of the European Union. Um, right, we've just been talking about, um, you know, the early context and dilemmas facing the European Union in its sort of embryonic intellectual phase. Um, and I was making the point that history is a factor here, and there's real people, real contexts to think about. It's not just an intellectual project; it's a project that has to deal and juggle with a lot of geopolitical dynamics and also material, human, geographic dynamics as well. One of those would be the fact that the infrastructure in Europe had completely collapsed after World War II. It was very hard for markets to function. It was very hard for food to circulate, to get food circulated. And so, really, for first couple of years after World War II, especially the winters of 1947, 1948, it was a borderline humanitarian catastrophe in Europe. A lot of refugees. The economic impact of the war was enormous. There was starvation, drought, on top of just freezing winters. In that context, U.S. Assistant Secretary of State Clayton wrote in a letter home that millions of people in Europe are slowly starving. And of course, beyond this, there is an awareness on the part of the victors of the war that the war itself, for many people in Europe, was not a war between the West and Germany, or democracy versus fascism, but rather communism versus fascism. And this was not, this is to say, communism was not just an idea that was limited to those living in the Soviet Union. The French, the Italians were very taken with communism as an ideology. And in elections after World War II in both of those countries, the communists performed incredibly well. They almost won their elections. And the communist parties almost came to power. So certainly, from an American perspective, this was a concern. The environmental, the economic crisis in Europe after World War II was creating a lot of desperation among the people, among major populations, and for that reason, then action would have to be addressed. And so that action then would have to address certain dilemmas in terms of the geopolitical game, if you will, confronting American policy makers after World War II. And one of those big issues was the German problem, so-called German problem, which is basically this: if Europe was going to ward off communism and stop communist parties gaining power in places like France and Italy, there would really need to be a genuine road to recovery. There would have to be a real and meaningful prosperity delivered to the people of Europe through free market means. And this would be impossible at the end of the day, they believed, without some sort of German recovery, because after all, Germany had been the industrial powerhouse of Europe, and without a recovery or a reconstruction of German industry, the kind of capitalism that the Americans had hoped to implement in Europe would not be possible. So that's one aspect of it. How do you lead an economic recovery out of this disaster without Germany? And then also, similarly, another aspect of the German problem was the defense aspect. How could you defend Europe? How could you organize a European defense against the Soviets, for example, without a German contribution to that defense? And this, of course, is a paradox, because how can you do this without alienating the United Kingdom and France, who had just lost a lot of people and a lot of resources in fighting Germany, not once but twice in two terrible wars. So the Americans are sensitive to these dilemmas. And in his Harvard graduation address in 1947, George Marshall, an American general, is the Secretary of State under Truman. And he creates what he calls the Marshall Plan, which calls for Europeans to meet and create their own plan for rebuilding Europe, and that the United States would then fund this plan. And many historians, including the authors of your textbook, sort of record this as the starting point of the European Union. And I think a key question here is to what extent the Marshall Plan could be thought of as a success in that sense. Many do say it was the trigger for the EU and for the forthcoming EU cooperation, but the facts would suggest maybe that it wasn't as much as a success as all that, because the states involved, historically, this has been written about, weren't all that much cooperative with each other. Certainly, they did not go on to become what I think Marshall had envisioned, that the advent of a kind of a continental marketplace under one federal rule, like the United States had a federal government. That didn't happen, clearly. And at the end of the day, the question is well, why? Kind of goes back to our free rider problem earlier on. The logic of national security dictates that states are always going to kind of look after themselves before they look after someone else, and rightly so in some respects, right? Because you're always going to be afraid of what the other person is going to do to you when you're not looking, especially if the other person is Germany. So, twice bitten, twice as shy. And the French had said that the German recovery, to them, at least from their perspective, was not necessary for European economic development. The Americans had these hopes for economically restarting Germany and developing German defense industry, etc., to prepare for potential Soviet aggression. The French were not having it at all. The French had their own plan, and they wanted to keep the potential for German economic rearmament to a minimum. And so what we understand from this is that the Cold War threat was clearly not going to be or clearly wasn't being understood or grasped the same way by the Europeans and by the European powers and by the Americans. There was strong disagreements there. And of course, the Marshall Plan, insofar as it was a generous offer by the Americans and no doubt did a lot of good, its primary institution, which was called the OEEC, the Committee on European Economic Cooperation, didn't have any clout, really. It didn't have a lot of power, so really it couldn't coerce the Europeans into any kind of cooperation with each other. This would have to be strictly voluntary. So we're kind of in a bind here, and this French fear of German power is an obstacle that's going to have to be overcome in some way, shape, or form. So how is this problem going to be resolved? And to answer that question, we need to introduce ourselves to a gentleman by the name of Jean Monnet. Now, he's about as close as you're going to get to a founding father of the EU. He was a civil servant, a French civil servant. He had been the director of the French modernization plan, which was to, try to bring French industry up to par, and roads, highways, infrastructures, that kind of thing. And he was kind of a technocratic mindset, and he had this optimism that that the French way of looking at the German problem and the American way of looking at the German problem could be, there was a rational solution to this issue, that if we could just get past the sort of hang up about the state and needing to deal with issues on a level playing field, or a horizontal playing field might be a better way to put it. We can start to maybe innovate some new ideas about how to share power, which of course sounds complicated, but for Manet it wasn't that complicated. The key issue, Manet argued, was that if you looked on the map, and we will look at the map in a minute, that you have you can see here the Ruhr Valley running down into the Rhine River, which runs right through Germany. So the Ruhr was where most German industry was located, and you can see it's north of Belgium there, and to the east of the bottom of the Netherlands. Why is the Ruhr so important? The Ruhr is important because it is the so-called spark plug of Europe. There's a lot of coal there, and there's a lot of industry there, and so it's strategically very significant. If you're going to have industry, you're going to need that coal. And so long as it was in Germany, the French were worried about the long-term potential for German rearmament. They could make steel very efficiently using that coal. So while the Americans were advocating the Marshall Plan, it was obvious that Britain wasn't going to be leading it because of ideological objections. We talked earlier on about Churchill. So the only other real contender to address this issue was France. And as we've just been discussing, the French are afraid of German economic recovery because of the Ruhr Valley. So Monet's idea, and what ultimately persuades the French, specifically the French Parliament, to change their minds in the late 1940s, is that they began to see through Monet's auspices the idea of putting specifically the coal and steel sector of the Ruhr Valley under a common higher authority, which would be neither French nor German, but a sort of a sovereign entity that had power of referee over the two countries. Now that might sound like a very fuzzy, messy, weird thing, but it actually, from the perspective of many Europeans at the time, was sort of genius. Monet approached Robert Schuman, who was the French foreign minister. Schuman went to Adenauer, who was the German chancellor, and got his support, and then also managed to persuade the French parliament to join. And then not only that, but they got Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg involved too. And in May 9th, 1950, they launched this thing called the ECSC, the European Coal and Steel Community. You want to write that one down because it's basically the institution that will go on decades later to become what we know today as the EU. The exact same institution. It has direct legal continuity of personality with the ECSC, the European Union today does. So Schuman Declaration, the day of the Schuman Declaration, May 9th, 1950, is still celebrated to this day as Schuman Day. And in the declaration, Schuman famously said, "Europe will not be made all at once or according to a single plan. It will be built through concrete achievements which first create a de facto solidarity." And there's a hint there at something which we're going to be revisiting the week after next when we talk about theories of European integration, because this idea of putting one sector, the coal and steel sector, under a common higher authority, and then, as you can see in the Schuman quote, that this might just be the first step in something that will eventually go on to create a de facto solidarity, i.e. that glue that we were talking about earlier on, when we were talking about the flaws of the Zollverein and the Anglo-French Treaty. This solidarity, this sense of identity of the citizens, not just with their own state, but with something other than that. Getting the French and the Germans to think of themselves as Europeans as opposed to just French and Germans. That somehow Schuman was saying, even in the kernel, he was saying that even in this very humble, modest, fuzzy, bureaucratic thing called the ECSC, that there was the kernel of, and I mean kernel in the spelling of the word KERNEL, right? The germ, the seed, kernel of something much bigger. And that's got to be something that maybe stops and makes us think for a second. How could they have known that something that modest might go on to produce something bigger? It's an interesting one. So one of the things we're going to be looking at, and we'd have to say off the bat, is that the progress that would be made, any progress that would be made in that respect, is going to run into a lot of problems. And one of those problems, a long history of problems, to be honest with you, and one of those problems is going to be literally, right the next year, 1948, the Berlin blockade. And it's just sort of a reminder that despite the apparent success of overcoming this antagonism between France and Germany, there is still, beyond the economic issue, there is the ever-present threat of the Soviet Union, and there's the reality for France and for Britain that defending Europe, and the Americans know this, right? I mean, defending Europe is going to take German power. And so we still have this problem of European defense, despite having resolved the economic issue, if you will. And the short-run solution to the defense problem is going to be NATO. And in 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, is born, largely an American initiative, working with the Brits, but also with a host of other European powers. The idea is going to be to try to, the US is going to enmesh its defense systems with the systems of the European countries of Western Europe. And they're all going to commit together to be the stopgap to allay fears of German power by themselves, but especially, of course, as the US is the big provider here and the biggest military by an order of magnitude, that basically America is going to be providing the defense for Germany, which means Germany doesn't have to have an army of its own. Now, that's a great solution, but it doesn't hold very long. As I said, it's only a short-term solution, because eventually you're going to have, with the Berlin blockade pictured here, a sense or sign that clearly the Soviet Union is a problem. And then you're going to have the Korean War looming in the late 40s. And so, the US would have to start diverting troops to Asia. And it would mean that maintaining capacity in Europe was going to be a problem, and so there was a solid need now for German rearmament. And with that in mind, then the U.S. issues an ultimatum in September 1950, and basically sticks it to the French and says, you've got to come up with a solution here. And to their credit, the French do make an effort, and what they come up with is called the Pleven Plan, named after the French Prime Minister, whose name I think was René. Prime Minister Pleven responds with the Pleven Plan, which says that Germany would not be allowed to have command of its own forces, that its forces would have to be put under basically a kind of a European government, like what we've just seen with the coal and steel community, right? And naturally, this raises questions in the American mind. Well, okay, guys, we have this thing called NATO, and America has a role to play in making decisions in that? Are you going to create a European Union command with no link to NATO? Does that mean that we, the Americans, will not have a say in how your forces are deployed? I mean, given that this is literally just after World War II, and there's still a lot of American soldiers in Europe, and Germany is occupied and divided, this kind of seems a daft idea to a lot of people who are observing this. So many people say that maybe the French were just delaying, that it was a delaying tactic, a prevarication, trying to see, if the crisis in Korea might calm down or whatever. And so in the end, the Americans had to sort of come up with some kind of response to this. And what they did was they asked the French if they would drop this idea of a supranational political aspect to the European defense community. And in exchange for that, the Americans were going to guarantee constraints on the possibility of a German military. So basically, the Americans are kind of backing down. And then in 1952, the military version of the Schuman Plan is signed, and a single European political and military authority comes into existence. But it comes into existence stillborn, if you'll forgive the use of the term, because effectively the organization went nowhere. It was signed into existence, but between being signed into existence and the stage of being ratified in the parliaments, which of course treaties like this often have to be ratified by the domestic parliaments, a number of things happened. Later in 1952, Eisenhower is elected. He has some very different ideas about how things should be done. And then you have the conflict in Korea reaching a stalemate, which means that it looks like that the war won't be continuing. It's not ending. The Korean War is still not technically over, by the way, but that the two forces are kind of locked in space at that parallel just north of Seoul, Korea. So and of course Stalin died, and Stalin was the major sort of embodiment of the figure that sort of embodied the Soviet threat, and so by 1953 the pressure seems off. So the European Defense Community, the EDC, fails to be ratified by the French Parliament, and the idea actually ends up kind of going nowhere, interestingly enough. Now, so the EDC is stillborn, but and the military political integration project is going nowhere. But the economic integration project, which Monet envisioned, is still very much on the table. Now, Monet believed that that Germany, of course, was central to any European integration project. But he really also believed that this idea of trying to create military integration was too premature. He believed that you had to produce a kind of a buy-in gradually, slowly, sector by sector, and that the economic integration was a better avenue to creating political integration than going straight for the military one, which is of course high politics, right? And people are okay if you start integrating the economy because it's important, but it's not like critical. Whereas military integration is very, very sensitive for a lot of people, because it really takes away your final say in things if you don't have military to back up your opinions in international politics, of course. So Monet is still going to play around with further economic integration, and he creates new ideas, right? What about putting, atomic energy is a new idea in Europe. So what about creating an agency that has supranational power that can govern the use of atomic energy in Europe? Great idea. Okay, so that doesn't seem too controversial. People seem to support it. Now, also critically, with the French kind of sore from defeat in their imperial activities in Indochina. It's becoming clear after World War II that France is not an empire anymore. And so the question of a quid pro quo to get France committed not just to a shared power in terms of coal and steel community, but actually a full integration of all sectors in the form of a common market is discussed. And the question is that if coal and steel was kind of the bait that got German buy-in to a European integration, how are you going to get the French to buy into a wider market, right? And the answer to that question famously is going to be the common agricultural policy. France, of course, largely being an agricultural power, if you will, more agricultural than Germany is. So, what is this common agricultural policy, I hear you ask? Good question. The short answer is that it was a quid pro quo for access that the Germans would have under the ECSC to the French market. France was not, of course, a steel or coal power, so the way to lure the French into further involvement with the European project was going to be effectively to give French citizens, French farmers, and all farmers of the European community access to each other's populations as consumers. But beyond that as well, there would have to be some sort of guarantee that the farmers would not get undercut by any competitive advantage that other consumers, that other farmers in other countries of other member states rather, might have. And so there was a price support aspect to it as well, which is very complex. And I don't think it would be a good idea for me to get too deep into it just now. We will, I think, talk about it. It's in the syllabus to talk about agriculture again in a few weeks' time. So I'll save the detail for there. But it is a significant step. The Common Agricultural Policy is a huge leap forward for the European Union in terms of putting in place the envisioned European Economic Community, which is the replacement organization for the ECSC. And in 1957, then the Treaty of Rome, famous Treaty of Rome, is signed, which creates the EEC rather, and Euratom. And the 6 member states at that time are France, Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Looking back at this signature, this signing, and the coming into existence of the EEC, an assistant to Monet by the name of Marjolin wrote in his memoir, I do not believe it is an exaggeration to say that this date, March 25th, 1957, represents one of the greatest moments of Europe's history. Who would have thought during the 1930s that the European states, which had been tearing one another apart for so many centuries, would be able to form a common market intended eventually to become an economic area that could be linked to one great dynamic market. This is sort of maybe ideology from the perspective of some people, but Monet definitely here sort of being celebrated as a founding father figure for the European Union, and perhaps rightly so. I mean, certainly I think there are people who will sort of cynically say that that Europe has always been kind of a conspiracy of some sort on the part of capitalists or whoever, right? But I mean, I think even if that is true, that sort of conspiracy theory, I think the truth is that people like Monet were thinking carefully about not just having their cake and eating it too, but really transforming European politics in a way that it would sort of leave it as not just an economic unit, but as something that people could really relate to and feel a sense of citizenship towards. So just 10 minutes left, guys, in this particular section, and I have a number of slides to get through, and I'm gonna fail. There's just too much to do here. So what I will do, I'll just press on and do maybe two or three more slides if I can in the next 10 minutes, and we'll just pick it up wherever we end up. We'll pick it up from there and next week. Okay, so let's just start with the empty chair crisis. Now, the person really sort of centrally sort of involved in this story is Charles de Gaulle, who was, of course, the famous military leader of Free France during the war, and then the head of the French provisional government from 1944 to 1946, who then stepped away from politics but was called on by the nation to return as president in 1958, and who founded the Fifth Republic of France. And de Gaulle was not particularly in favor of this new supranationalism that people like Monet were in favor of. Now, the treaties, the Treaty of Rome, sometimes known as the Treaties of Rome, required that something like qualified majority voting would be introduced at some point in the development of the single market. What do we mean by qualified majority voting? Well, qualified majority voting was going to be the thing that would allow the European Union to grow effectively. Without qualified majority voting, every nation state that was a member would have a potential veto against any policy that the other members would propose. So QMV, or qualified majority voting, was going to remove the veto to a certain extent by introducing in its place qualified majority voting, specifically for non-controversial policy areas. Sometimes we call these low politics areas as opposed to high politics areas, which I was kind of hinting at earlier on. We were talking about military stuff. This was not going to be to do with military affairs, right? But basically, it meant that the larger countries, France, Germany, would have a greater amount of votes than the individual smaller countries. So France and Germany, Italy, for example, in this iteration would get 4 votes each in QMV. And then the other community members, Belgium, Netherlands, would get 2 votes each, and Luxembourg would just get 1 vote each. Now, what that would mean effectively would be that France and Germany would have Italy would obviously combine together to have a lot of votes, but Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg could ally with Italy, for example, to counterweigh or to veto whatever France and Germany were wanting to do. And given that Italy was a more peripheral economy, it would generally tend to stand, or prefer to stand, at least in some areas, with the more peripheral countries. So you have these different sorts of configurations of voting that could result. Anyway, in 1965, the European Commission President, Walter Hallstein, proposed to accelerate the progress towards QMV, and he wanted also to change the budgetary framework such that the European Union could start to raise money for itself through tariffs by taking money from taxes on foreign goods and services coming into the European Union from other countries. So Hallstein sort of becomes this emblematic figure, especially for de Gaulle, of this sort of character that's proposing supranationalism because he wants these new powers for the European Commission, right? So de Gaulle and Hallstein end up on a kind of a collision course, and de Gaulle uses the issue of the CAP, the Common Agricultural Funding, to thwart Hallstein, because CAP funding, having been sort of agreed upon, was not scheduled to commence until 1970. The institutions wouldn't be in place for it until 1970. But de Gaulle believed that because Hallstein was trying to press ahead and make the common market come into existence earlier than was planned, and 1968 specifically, that de Gaulle felt that the CAP funding should also move up a couple of years to 1968, and that these things should all start together. Now, and that doesn't seem like maybe a huge disagreement, but in 1965, when the European Council meets, we'll discuss the European Council in a full lecture in a few weeks' time. But for now, just so you know that it's the place where the executives of the European countries that are members of the European Union will meet. It's a kind of parliament of nations, so to speak. So France basically made progress on QMV contingent on CAP funding being stepped up, and this meant that the council would not be able to make progress until there was some kind of agreement on this. And then in late October that same year, the council met without France being in the room. De Gaulle refused to participate in the meeting because he had heard no sort of promises of the CAP funding. And the council decided to make progress on QMV regardless. And so this is the empty chair crisis, that France refused to take its seat at the council until this quid pro quo would be put on the table. Now, curiously enough, that was 1965, but by 1966, France was ready to resume talks. And the question here is why? Well, first of all, probably it was feeling isolated. There was a sense, I think, that all the other member states really wanted to press ahead with QMV, and France was basically kind of being left out in the cold. Secondly, however, de Gaulle had been up for election in late 65 and had only narrowly won a victory against his opponent, who was a gentleman by the name of Francois Mitterrand, who will subsequently himself go on to become president by the 1970s. And so, weakened, de Gaulle, I think, is under pressure from domestic constituencies to get back to the table, and he does so, but won't really budge on the core issues. And so the result is something called the Luxembourg Compromise, where the nation states agree, instead of having QMV instantiated, that they would actually allow the veto to remain. This was very important to de Gaulle, and this would be an accepted requirement moving forward. Certainly for, and I quote, very important issues where nation states would feel that their fundamental interests were being violated. So effectively, even though the French were now back at the table and the empty chair crisis was over, it was a victory for de Gaulle. He got what he wanted. The temporary advance on CAP funding was approved. So he got what he wanted in that instance, and in the same breath, the lack of progress on QMV defanged the Commission, because it meant that the Commission could not make progress with its plans, because obviously the veto was still there, and QMV, which would be the only mechanism by which the Commission could get that approved, was not in the cards. So the Luxembourg decision, the so-called Luxembourg Compromise, impeded progress for a very long time. It had a massive impact on the development of the European community, and effectively it was a type of legislative stalemate. Now, moving quickly on to the British question. 1961, we have the first British application to join the six members, and we have this first application being made by the Conservative government of Prime Minister Harold Macmillan. Now, why was Macmillan interested in joining the EEC? Primarily because Macmillan had accepted that there was a sort of an opportunity cost for not being part of the common market. The United Kingdom had already been part of its own kind of special free trade area called EFTA, the European Free Trade Area, with countries like Norway, and that was making progress, but it was not enough. It was not a mechanism or institution which would give Britain a right to vote and have a decision in how priorities were being set within the six, which is where the common market was being developed. So there was no seat, so to speak, at the big boys' table. And now, on the other hand, while Macmillan was sort of realizing the United Kingdom would maybe have an interest in being part of the EEC, existing members, and specifically de Gaulle, were concerned about the United Kingdom's relationship with the United States and how that would potentially interfere with EEC autonomy, because effectively you wouldn't know if you were dealing with the UK or you were dealing with the UK as a puppet of the United States, so to speak. I'm being very crude in saying that, but that, I think, was the concern. So de Gaulle vetoed the British application. Then in May 1967, this time under the Labour government of Prime Minister Harold Wilson, the British tried again. And de Gaulle wrote that British entry would obviously mean the breaking up of a community that has been built and that functions according to the rules, which would not bear such a monumental exception. Part of what was going on here was, of course, that in 1962, Kennedy had announced a sort of a vision for US-European relations, and NATO was going to be at the center of that. De Gaulle became extremely worried about American and North Atlantic influence on the autonomous decisions of the Europeans, and really, it became very clear that so long as de Gaulle was sort of part of the story, that there would be no progress whatsoever. Okay, guys. So running out of time, we're out of time, unfortunately, for this week. I'll pick it up here. We're just about to enter into the 1970s. It's a good place to stop for us, I think, because next week is all about the development of the euro. And really that story begins in the 1970s. So we'll pick it up here next week, and I hope this week's lecture was intelligible to you, and that you enjoyed it. Certainly it's been a pleasure having you for this time, and I look forward to seeing you online here again next week as we trace the story of the development of the euro, and bring ourselves up to speed from 1970 to the present day in next week's lecture. Thanks very much. We'll talk to you soon.